Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to join us for our very special video cast today. I'd like to introduce you to our esteemed guest, Andy Greenberg. Andy is a technology journalist and currently a senior writer at Wired magazine. Also in 2015, he wrote an article about Charlie Miller and Chris Valesek's Jeep hack, which resulted in the recall of 1.4 million vehicles by Chrysler. By the way, if you haven't already seen that video of them remotely just hacking into Andy's Jeep and stopping it while he's driving, you really need to. Not safe for work, so don't do it right now if you're in the office for any reason. But it's hilarious. So, by the way, we've also hacked into all of your cameras, and some of you need to put pants on. Just kidding, please don't leave. So anyway, Andy's latest publication, Sandworm, is a hair-raising cautionary tale about the burgeoning world of state-sponsored hackers. So thank you so much for joining us today, Andy.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Kind of be here, just be here in some sense with you.
Great. Well, thank you. First, I'm going to just start off by a really quick poll question to see how prepared all of you were for today. So how many of you have actually read Sandworm already? Putting the poll up right now. Five more seconds. Wow. Okay.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. I'm really surprised, actually. I thought it was going to be, we sent you all books, but didn't know if you actually read it in time yet. But I'm very happy to see that you have, so we don't have to come and get them from you since we have your address. Sorry to scare all the security people before they've had their coffee. All right, so let's get started. Okay, turning off the poll right now. So Andy, what was the impetus for you writing this story? It really was an investigative journey. So what made you want to write a book like this?
So in late 2016, my editors at Wired they were the ones who told me that they wanted to do a big cyber war issue of Wired. They wanted me to find the big story of cyber war, which we would do like a whole magazine all about cyber war. At that point in my reporting was pretty skeptical about the whole nature of cyber war. I wasn't sure that I even believed that cyber war was a real thing. I mean, my editors were of course thinking about in late 2016 the Russian interference in that presidential election, which you may have heard of, and I didn't see that as cyber war at all. I saw that as kind of just digital dirty politics, kind of typical spy tactics, but done with a very high profile and splashy means. So, but I went looking for a real cyber war story, and to me, cyber war means state-sponsored hackers who are carrying out not just espionage, but actual disruptive or destructive cyber attacks on an enemy's critical infrastructure. Really, I mean, to maybe in the strictest definition, and my colleague Kim Zetter, she had been my colleague at Wired before she left. She had written a great story about the first ever cyber attack that had caused a blackout in Ukraine, and that blackout had taken place in December of 2015, and it had come in the midst of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So to me, that kind of seemed like at least a quintessential act of cyber war. I mean, this is like the kind of cyber war event we'd all been waiting for when hackers turned out the lights to civilians for the first time. So I began looking at Ukraine, and Kim had left by this point. So I kind of took over the state-sponsored hacking cyber war beat, and I eventually ended up getting very deep in this Ukrainian cyber war story. I went to Ukraine, but I also just delved in with a lot of sources and found that there really was a kind of full-blown cyber war occurring in Ukraine. Like Russian hackers had, along with this physical invasion of Ukraine in the east of the country, the annexation of Crimea, following the Ukrainian Revolution, Russian hackers were hitting every strata of Ukrainian society, government agencies, the media, and ultimately these utilities. That they turned off the power to 250,000 Ukrainians in the west of the country. And just as I was looking into all of this, it happened again. There was a second blackout in the capital this time. So I could see that now that there was, in fact, an unfolding, an escalating cyber war that really was happening before our eyes. I was kind of late to the story, but I wasn't too late. Like I could still get in and dig in and tell the story. And I really wanted to tell it in a way that people had not told cyber war stories before. I wanted to kind of capture the human perspective of the people, the way the good war journalism is told, like the perspective of victims and the people who are the collateral damage and the people who are in the trenches. So I went to Ukraine and I spent weeks there just on an initial trip, getting to know the people inside of these utilities, the people who were the network defenders. And one of the main kind of characters that I met was Alexi, who I can talk about if that'd be interesting. So Alexi was the chief information security officer at Starlight Media, which was the biggest TV broadcaster in Ukraine. Was hit with one of the first cyber attacks in the first wave of this Ukrainian cyber war. The hackers, who would ultimately be revealed to be Sandworm, planted in their network a kind of logic bomb designed to destroy hundreds of their computers. He had prevented this attack or at least done the incident response on it, and then gone off to become this incident responder who was kind of the go-to responder to wave after wave of these attacks in Ukraine. And then when I met him, by the time that I'd met him in Ukraine, in Kiev, in early 2017, he had also been at home when the lights were turned out to his apartment. He was in that second blackout. So he kind of became for me this, I want to say like the Forrest Gump character, because that's pejorative, but like he was the guy who seemed to be there for every moment of this story. And Alexi became a kind of central character in first this Wired cover story that I put together in early 2017 about this notion that you could look to Ukraine, it seemed, to see the future of cyber war, that things were happening in Ukraine that were not happening anywhere else. And that in fact, not only could you use it as a kind of petri dish just to observe these things, but that we should be aware that what happened to Ukraine would soon spread to the rest of the world, that Ukraine is a bellwether for all of us, that in some sense, if we don't act and try to stop what Russia is doing in Ukraine, we could be next. And this was not exactly like the story that my editors were looking for, but it was a cover story that we published that summer of 2017. And bizarrely, when you put out a piece like this, a kind of predictive piece that is looking at these blackouts and saying we could be next, looking at these like terribly destructive cyber attacks, you don't want the prediction to come true, and you certainly don't expect it to come true immediately. But that is weirdly what happened. The week that magazine cover story hit newsstands is when NotPetya hits. In fact, the very day that it was showing up in subscribers' mailboxes was the day that NotPetya began spreading around the world. So I don't know if I should get right into NotPetya, but that NotPetya was the reason ultimately that this would be not just a magazine article, but a book. That after this massive worst cyber attack in history hit is when I saw that there was a larger story here, and that's when it took some months, but I put together this now kind of obvious thing that there was a whole chain, a whole arc of these attacks that represented the most aggressive and destructive hacker group in history, arguably, and that's when I knew that there was a book to be written.
Well, great, thank you, Andy. So I think it's safe to say that maybe one or two people in our audience are nerds, and the rest of them are lying. So they may have recognized the name Sandworm from Dune. Is there any relation to that? If not, where does the name come from?
Yeah, I'm a little worried about this new Dune movie that's going to mess up my search engine optimization. Actually, when people search for Sandworm, like where they can even find my book anymore. But yes, like I am a huge Dune nerd myself. But the reason that this group is called Sandworm is, and I kind of, when I first learned about these attacks in Ukraine and saw that it was this one group of Russians, I looked to I kind of went back in time to find their origins. And they had been discovered by this little company called Eyesight Partners, now owned by FireEye. And Eyesight Partners had found that this one group of Russian hackers, and they'd left exposed their command and control server. And on that command and control server was a Russian how-to document for using their malware. So it was very clear that they were Russian actors from the beginning. And they were planting this piece of apparent espionage malware called Black Energy on a bunch of victims. And it seemed at first that they were kind of doing typical Russian spying things. But then as Eyesight looked closer, they began to see that these infections were occurring not just on espionage targets or kind of typical NATO Ukrainian targets, but on critical infrastructure networks as well. And some of them were even in the US. So Black Energy had shown up on in the American power grid. So once I learned that was part of this realization that this was not a I should actually say what I was trying to get to here, which is that each one of those victims, each one of those instances of Black Energy had a little snippet of a campaign code used to identify the victim, and each one was a reference to Dune, the sci-fi science fiction novel. So that's why Eyesight Partners named this group Sandworm. But to me, that was kind of a perfect name, and there are different names for this Russian group. I mean, some people call them, ESET calls them Telebots, and CrowdStrike calls them Voodoo Bear, but I love Sandworm as this name because it was, first of all, it was the first name, but it captures this idea of like this monster that lies in wait underground and then occasionally rises to do terribly destructive things, which is what sandworms are in Dune and what this group ultimately would prove to be. And but also the fact that the Eyesight had found samples of Sandworm's code in the American power grid a year before they would take that step and turn off the lights in Ukraine, that they would actually carry out a power grid attack in Ukraine. That to me was evidence that this is not going to be a story just about Ukraine. This is that Sandworm is a threat to the West as well. And initially that was, just a kind of hint, a clue, but then with NotPetya, it became a reality. Like NotPetya hit us here in the US as well as Ukraine.
Yeah. So do you think it was beneficial for the West to see these attacks?
Well, so I think that, yes, we learned a lot from it, but it's almost, it's you could say like, yes, it's certainly helpful to just watch these terrible things be inflicted on Ukrainians. We can see threats on the horizon. We can learn about them and try to protect ourselves. But ultimately, that's not enough. I mean, we kind of treated Ukraine, I think, as a faraway foreign case study. Part of the story of this book is that one person after another was trying to warn both Ukrainians and Western researchers that what was happening in Ukraine should be put to a stop, that Western governments needed to speak out, not simply to observe, as you were kind of asking, but to say this is not okay, to condemn what Russia is doing publicly, to use diplomatic means to try to stop them, to indict the hackers involved, to sanction Russia for what they were doing, and that didn't happen. No one even in the US or UK or European governments even named Sandworm as a threat until it was too late, until their attack in Ukraine had hit us too. We did not learn enough from Sandworm to prevent NotPetya from doing billions of dollars of damage to American companies on American soil. And I feel like for the few people at least who have not read the book, maybe I should talk about what NotPetya really was. I mean, what's the effects of NotPetya? I mean, NotPetya was at first it looked like a ransomware worm, and it spread. It started, I guess it was seeded out initially using this Ukrainian accounting software called MEDOC, kind of the TurboTax or Quicken of Ukraine. But then it spread using a combination of a leaked NSA exploit, Eternal Blue, and Mimikatz, this password credential stealing tool that's really used in all sorts of state-sponsored attacks all the time. But this time it was integrated into this automated worm, and it at first appeared to be a ransomware worm. It was demanding a ransom, but very quickly Ukrainians began to tell me that they were trying to pay the ransom and finding that you could not actually recover your files. That this was on the very first day. Alexi Asinsky, for instance, was telling me this is not a ransom. This is not ransomware. This is a destructive worm pretending to be ransomware. And I was initially fooled, but when I heard this from Alexi, I began to look into it, and then forensically, Western researchers too were finding that you could not pay the ransom. And with this combination of the MEDOC seeding and then those intertwined exploits, NotPetya just spread more virulently than any worm I certainly have covered in my career. And it just carpet bombed the entire internet of Ukraine and took down 22 banks, 4 hospitals in Ukraine that I was aware of, multiple airports, every government agency. By some measures, it destroyed 1 out of 10 computers in Ukraine. It literally decimated the Ukrainian internet. But then this is like the kind of, in some ways, one of the big themes of the book, that this was maybe an attempt to just destroy the entire national internet of Ukraine, but there are no borders for these things. And NotPetya immediately leapt out beyond Ukraine's borders and began inflicting damage like we'd never seen before. I mean, we only learned about this as public companies began to report their losses to shareholders. But, Maersk lost ultimately $300 million. Maersk, the world's largest shipping conglomerate. Merck reported $870 million. Now they're telling their insurer it's 1.3 billion. Mondelez, which owns Cadbury and Nabisco, Reckitt Benckiser, the construction firm, each one of these companies was losing hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, any of those attacks on their own would have been historic, but together they added up to, by the White House's estimate, $10 billion in damage, which is, I think WannaCry maybe cost $8 billion. Nothing else really has come close. This was, just an unprecedented level of devastation globally. And for Maersk in particular, I should say that I spent months of the reporting of this book just trying to find any of these public companies that would tell me about their experience of how they managed to lose hundreds of millions of dollars. And none of these companies would talk to me, nor would they even publicly say that Russia had done this. And I almost felt like I was being gaslit. I mean, it was very bizarre, because within days of NotPetya hitting, some researchers at ESET, for instance, had begun to tie it back to those black energy attacks, to earlier Sandworm attacks, to the blackouts. But no one in any government or any of these victim companies seemed to want to say the name Sandworm, to even say that this was Russia that had done this to them, even as they were losing hundreds of millions of dollars. So I spent about, I would say, 6 months of the reporting of this book just trying to get any of these companies to talk about their experience of victimization, like what NotPetya did to them. And ultimately, Maersk never officially talked to me, but I found a few brave sources inside the company who I could use to kind of piece together the full experience of how the world's largest shipping firm was taken down by a piece of code. And it was very harrowing. I mean, Jenny, should I get into like what happened to Maersk specifically, or just make, I don't know if we have time for that.
Maybe touch on it. We have so many questions pouring in, so we might be here till about 5.
Yeah, well, I heard everything from like the experience of the guy in the office who watched every computer screen around the room go black, 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 black. And then, people had to vault over the physical turnstiles in the building because even they were paralyzed by this attack as they watched their entire IT, as they watched the company go brain dead, essentially. And as that happened, 17 of Maersk's terminals and ports around the world these, giant one square mile man-made peninsulas where, ships the size of the Empire State Building pull up with an Empire State Building's worth of cargo on top of them. These ships were arriving and nobody knew what was inside of them. Tens of thousands of trucks are lining up outside of these ports. The checkpoints to each of the terminals are dead, so they can't even communicate with the truck drivers. It was just a fiasco. It disrupted the global economy in a way we never actually seen before. And it was just a catastrophe on a global scale. I mean, these are terminals from Los Angeles to the Netherlands to Mumbai, like everywhere in the world. This was happening simultaneously. That is just the experience of one company. NotPetya touched countless companies. We don't really know how many in Russia as well. I mean, there's evidence that this was truly all collateral damage. I don't think that Sandworm intended to do this to Russian companies too. There's also there are stories about how the medical record systems in American hospitals through kind of second and third order effects were shut down by NotPetya. I mean, NotPetya is the reason this book exists, and I could just rant about it all day long, but maybe we should move on so that we can get to some of these questions too.
Okay, so who really is Sandworm?
Well, right. So after there's kind of three parts of this book. There's sort of like the detective story of all of these researchers at FireEye and ESET and other places tracking what Sandworm is doing as they carry out these blackout attacks and other unprecedented terrible things, trying to warn the world. Then it's too late. NotPetya hits, and the story becomes kind of a disaster story instead, just tracking the damage, the effects of NotPetya's destruction as it spreads around the world. But then the third part of the book is me, trying to figure out who did this, who is Sandworm, and yeah, I don't know. Should I spoil the ending? I guess most people here have read the book, so and for those who haven't, it's not a terrible spoiler. But Sandworm is ultimately a part of the GRU, the Russia's military intelligence agency. The theory that I, through amazing work largely at FireEye, but some other people did this too. I've since learned, I've pieced this together. FireEye was able to follow forensic clues that pointed to Unit 74455 of the GRU, and I published that theory for the first time in the book in November of last year, and then just in February, the UK and US governments finally confirmed that is correct, that Sandworm is Unit 74455 of the GRU. And that's very gratifying for me, in part because, I'd spent 3 years trying to figure out who these guys are. But it also means that we know where they're located, because the Robert Mueller investigation even included in their indictment of some GRU hackers related to election hacking, I should say, not to any of this stuff, that included an address for Unit 74455 of the GRU. And I went as far as going to this building on the outskirts of Moscow, just out of a sense of completism, to try to get as close as I could to these hackers that I had been obsessed with for the years-long, investigative process of this book. And it turns out that really was the building that they were in, this building called the Tower in North Moscow. That is now confirmed. But the other thing that this means, now that we know that Sandworm is Unit 74455 of the GRU, that also means that Sandworm was responsible for some of the most direct attacks on the 2016 election. Those intrusions in the state boards of elections that accessed the voter rolls of several states and hundreds of thousands of people's information, that was carried out by Unit 74455 of the GRU. So as we were kind of watching Sandworm carry out these terrible attacks in Ukraine and saying nothing, they were actually, they were hitting in some of the most direct ways, our own electoral infrastructure too, even before NotPetya, proved that we really should have been paying attention to all this.
Great. No, thank you. You answered my next question already. So I think we're going to go ahead and turn over the questions to the audience now. I see a lot of them pouring in. Please continue to add them to the chat window. And I did see a question earlier about asking who Stefan is, and probably want to know who I am too. So probably that should have happened in the beginning. But yeah, my name's Janice McColgan. I'm the head of marketing for Stratacore, and Stefan is our VP of Cyber, and he's going to start us off by reading off some of your questions.
Yeah, great. Again, Andy, always great to see you, and love the continuous excellence as you push out phenomenal journalism, especially journalism that the other cyber practitioners and leaders on this call can relate to intimately, and really translating a lot of that information from the real world and the desires and the people aspect of it to the bits and the bytes that many of the practitioners see here on the daily basis.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, you guys know the technique. You are smarter about this stuff than I am. But what I try to bring is, like, I talk to the people, I talk to the victims, and I go to Ukraine and try to bring back these human stories. But sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
No, that's great. And that actually, Brandon just queued up a question on that, which is one that I wanted to hit in on a little bit more. So you mentioned that you went to northern Moscow, you went to Russia to try to find the unit 74455, and what was that experience like for you going on that investigative journalism trip to figure it out? And there's a lot of questions there with safety and risk and perspective. What was it like?
Well, it was not pleasant. I mean, and it was, I kind of knew that it was a strange kind of reporting trip to go on. Usually when I go somewhere, I expect to meet the people that I'm looking for and talk to them. But I sort of knew that this was almost like a futile exercise. That I went to Russia in part to go to Zero Nights and to meet people there, to as one kind of inroad to try to at least make an attempt to get it close enough to the hacker community in Russia to do due diligence and figure out if I could identify anybody related to Sandworm. But then ultimately, it's not easy to do that. Like this is an intelligence agency that kills defectors. I mean, the GRU literally tried to kill Sergei Skripal not long before I went to Russia, and he was a GRU defector. So I knew that this was going to be very difficult, but so it was a strange trip to begin with. But then I also, of course, as I'm sure anybody here would, if you go to Russia, you can't travel normally. You have to have a burner computer, a burner phone, and I was completely disconnected from essentially like every part of, every account, every piece of sensitive data that I would normally have access to. And it was very lonely. I mean, it was weird and not a fun way to travel for 2 weeks, to not be able to speak to my friends or family, essentially. I mean, it was, it's a very difficult and very paranoid way to work and to live. But it was even disappointing in a sense that after taking all of these precautions and really looking over my shoulder physically, like everywhere I went all the time, I never got any sense that I was being followed or tracked or hacked or that I was going to be detained or anything. I took all of these necessary paranoid measures and really didn't even get like a good story out of it. In some ways, if you do all this stuff, you want at least to be detained, and you want them to grab your burner phone and see that there's nothing on it. But if they were watching me, then I never got any sense of it, which is kind of even more frustrating.
Yeah, that had you been picked up, that would have been almost like a feather in the cap of the hey
of the book. Yeah, but I don't flatter myself that I'm that important to the Kremlin or the GRU. And sometimes I wonder if they wanted me to even tell parts of this story. I mean, I want to tell this story because I feel like it's about holding the GRU accountable, about creating a response, telling the international community you have to be aware of what the GRU is doing and has done and deter them. But they made all of this as like, hey, cool, this American finally recognized how talented and badass we are, and he's finally told this story that we've been waiting for everybody. They're waiting for someone to tell about all the insanely reckless and dangerous attacks we've done.
I think that's a really, really interesting perspective, and kind of leads into our next talk on the attack side. And it's almost a proliferation question or a counter proliferation is from James. Do you feel it's in the best interest of the country to hoard exploits and use them as potential weapons, or to disclose the vulnerabilities and exploits publicly?
Yeah, it's I was going to say it's an eternal question, but that's a very loaded, no pun intended. But like, I do, it's very difficult for me to say because I'm not inside of Cyber Command. I don't know what they're doing with some of these exploits. I do think that we now have evidence of how dangerous it is to hold on to these very powerful exploits like Eternal Blue and Eternal Romance that were leaked by the shadow brokers and used by first WannaCry and then NotPetya. I mean, the summer of 2017, beyond just NotPetya, was the most like kind of tragic illustration possible of the failure of the equities, the VEP, the vulnerabilities equities process of we in the US held on to the secret vulnerability until it was stolen and used against us in the worst possible way. And the New York Times has reported that it was also not just leaked by the shadow brokers, but actually spotted with network logs that the Chinese saw being used against them and used elements of Eternal Blue themselves. So I do think that there has to be some kind of process of disclosure. It does definitely whatever happened with Eternal Blue, like we should not repeat that. Like we shouldn't hold on to something that powerful as long as we did in that case. That I think is like the perfect worst case scenario. But I also don't know what Cyber Command is doing with 0 days in terms of espionage and what that might accomplish. I do think that I guess I can say generally, I think that the US government seems enamored with offensive hacking capabilities more, or has been certainly for the last many years, more enamored with offensive hacking than thoughtful about the ways that those same tools can be used against us. And we are in many ways more vulnerable to the same sorts of attacks. And that, living in this glass house, we should really err towards more disclosure, more security, more defense for everyone. I mean, that means disclosing even some of these bad bugs. And I think that no matter how useful they may feel, how powerful they may make Cyber Command. And I think that we've seen some evidence of that. I forget what the bug was. It's not coming to mind immediately. But just in the last year, we saw the NSA disclose a huge vulnerability. And I think that the creation of what's called the Cybersecurity Directorate at the NSA is a sign also that maybe the NSA is becoming more aware of this. That we are not quite as we're maybe starting to rein in this trigger happy mentality and think more about defending everyone rather than maintaining the ability to attack.
Phenomenal response, and I'm sure some of the policy folk down at like George Washington or down in DC would love to have you come and talk on some of those policy implications as well, especially given your background. We have another question from Ron. It's kind of broken up into a couple questions here, so we'll start with the more general of the two. And it's curious what your thoughts are on Russia actively or not hacking the next U.S. presidential election.
Well, to be honest, I haven't seen the evidence that it's happening yet. But I'm very concerned. I mean, I have my sensors up, like waiting for this. I mean, expecting it. I should say that just today, I published a news story. The NSA just put out an alert that Sandworm themselves are exploiting, have been exploiting this bug in XM, the mail server software, and we don't know what they're doing with that. But when the NSA warns about that, like, you have to wonder, and that's a bug that could easily be used for, I don't know, to pivot into other parts of a network and do disruptive sabotage things like Sandworm has done, or it could be used to steal a bunch of emails and do a hacking and leaking operation as happened in 2016. The New York Times has reported, although I think the evidence was like a little thin, that the GRU has hacked Burisma, the Ukrainian oil firm that was at the center of the Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, I don't know, sort of purported scandal and Trump impeachment. There are, we're starting to see not quite evidence, but hints at least, or possibilities of how this could play out in 2020. Let's see, the hack of the DNC came to light in June of 2016, I believe. And then things really escalated very quickly with Kuchefer 2.0, the state boards of election attacks, the attack on the Clinton campaign, as well as the DNC. So, we haven't actually reached that stage in the cycle if it's going to repeat. But I also don't believe that it's going to be the same this time. I mean, I think that the GRU thrives on unpredictability, that they're really inventive, and they do a lot of innovation. They seem to be kind of trying to outdo themselves and impress their bosses all the time with new techniques and more reckless, dangerous things. In 2016, we saw Sandworm hack the state boards of election. We still don't know really what they were trying to do there, but maybe that was the kind of practice run for something that might involve, voter rolls or voter suppression more directly, rather than some kind of influence operation like in 2016. So that's all that's all speculation, but I do think that you can see the groundwork for something that might happen in 2020, or they might sit it out just because they, in some ways, they got their candidate last time, and they've polarized the U.S. Now we run our own influence operations on ourselves. There's plenty of homegrown domestic disinformation on Twitter already, and so I don't know. It could be that Putin, his greatest trick, or the GRU this time will just try to prove everyone wrong by doing nothing, and the damage in some senses is already done. I mean, we are still, I think, suffering from the effects of that 2016 election interference.
Yeah, and I think that highlights a big piece is that an information operation, or a cyber attack specifically, how you define that, is going to run towards some sort of an outcome. So if they're already, or whatever threat actors already reached that sort of outcome, then they'll probably change focus and go somewhere else. Next question here from Carrie, kind of on a methodology of writing the book and doing the journalism piece of it. You mentioned Kim already in here as well. So was Sandworm influenced by Countdown to Zero Day? Because I know there was at least one reference in the Stuxnet chapter. And then if so, how did the methodology for the journalism maybe differ from Countdown to Zero Day?
Oh, yeah. Well, I was not only influenced by Countdown to Zero Day, but I just learned a lot of the kind of background of this story from Countdown to Zero Day. I mean, Countdown to Zero Day is, of course, about Stuxnet. This story is kind of about the post-Stuxnet world of cyber war. I think that Kim made the case very well. I mean, that's a masterful book, and it makes the case that, in part, what it shows is that Stuxnet was the opening of this Pandora's box, that it was it was the first true act of cyber war. To me, I felt like I had to tell that story, at least just in passing, or in the kind of flashback, to show how it lays the groundwork for what Sandworm would do, because Sandworm would not only carry out the first cyber physical attack since Stuxnet. I mean, many years have passed, but that first blackout attack in 2015 was in some ways the first time that hackers had reached out from the internet to affect physical critical infrastructure the way that Stuxnet did when it destroyed Iranian nuclear enrichment centrifuges. But then in 2016, Sandworm also created only the second ever custom coded piece of malware that did that kind of cyber physical attack, which we call Crash Override or InDestroyer. So to capture how close to unprecedented that Sandworm attack was, you have to show the precedent for it, which is, there's only one, and it's Stuxnet. So, and Stuxnet, I think, represents the advent of cyber war in some ways. So when I told that part of the story, I really just wanted to credit Kim as having, laid that all out for historians forever, I think. So, I really explicitly was citing her and leaning on her work in that one chapter. But yeah, I mean, Kim is an amazing state-sponsored hacking and cyber war reporter, and I learned a lot from her when she was at Wired.
Oh, absolutely, and another great book for anybody in the audience that hasn't read it yet. Go check it out. Really great way to understand a full campaign from start to finish and the international implications of those campaigns.
But the part of the question is, like, how is it different? And I think
yes.
I did not. I don't think that either Kim nor I managed to really get in deep with the hackers carrying out the attacks in these stories. She didn't, I don't think, interview the NSA hackers, Cyber Command, CIA, Israeli hackers who built Stuxnet. And I, despite all my efforts, never actually got into that tower, never got to talk to Sandworm. But what I was able to do, just because of circumstance, that Stuxnet that Kim couldn't do, was talk to the victims, and the victims were a huge part of this story. I mean, Kim had a much harder job there, because the victims of Stuxnet were Iranian, and this secret Iranian facility is not going to let her inside to capture the human experience of those attacks from the victim's perspective. But the Ukrainian electrical operators did let me inside and showed me where they were sitting when they watched their mouse movements be taken over by Sandworm, and watch their own mouse click through circuit breakers out of their control, and those kinds of moments. So I was lucky in a way, and this is one of the great gifts of this story. I mean, that Ukrainians were incredibly open about talking about this experience from the victim's perspective, and ultimately I found some of that at Maersk too, and other victims of NotPetya. So that's one thing that I was just lucky enough to be able to do that Kim, just out of because of the nature of the story, couldn't do. She was really telling a detective story from the researcher's angle.
Well, that's really interesting on that difference, especially being able to go meet Alexi in person, and he kind of became a central figure for the story because of his background,
right,
and all the different roles that he played over a long timeline.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Alexi ultimately would do response on NotPetya too. So he was just in every part of the story, and I tried to tell the story from the detective's perspective and from the victim's perspective. And Alexi was the one character who was both. I mean, he was this Ukrainian who had been caught in the attacks, but then also was doing the response on them. He was the main incident responder on that second blackout attack in 2016. I mean, he was just there for everything.
Oh yeah, an interesting character, and one that when we talk in a lot of different forums, we often bring up Alexi because he has that kind of timeline through it. Kind of a interesting, as I understand it, introverted champion from the story. The next question here from Connor is a kind of a question opinion, and it's: do you believe that the incentives and data breaching reporting structure is stacked against the victims of cyber attack?
This again, I guess, kind of gets at what I was saying, that none of these companies wanted to talk about being a victim of NotPetya. I mean, I think that I did come across this problem that I'm sure that I have helped to create as a member of the cybersecurity media, but that we're all, I think, guilty of, which is that this blame the victim mentality. When you can't find the offender, when you can't interview Sandworm, the impulse is to just investigate the victim, to show all the ways that Equifax, for instance, screwed up, and we call it the Equifax breach, instead of talking about who carried out that breach. And so that's often very warranted. And even Maersk, in this story, I couldn't help myself but to point out the ways that they screwed up and allowed the mistakes that they made that allowed Sandworm to just totally devastate the company. Having a whole security revamp plan, but they never made it part of their engineers' bonuses, so they never actually carried it forward, that kind of thing. I mean, but there is a blame the victim mentality in the media, the cybersecurity media, that I think has been warranted in some cases, but also really counterproductive. And I found that because all of these companies, I think, didn't want to to be in a headline. They didn't want this to be seen as the Maersk breach or the Merck breach or the FedEx breach. They didn't want to talk, and it made it very difficult to tell this, I think, really historically valuable story about the worst ever cyber attack in history that really had nothing to do with their customers. They were the victims. It wasn't like a breach of their customers' data. It was a sabotage event that hit them. So, but that fear on the victim's part was really counterproductive.
I think that kind of highlights and segues into the next question there of transitioning from that, and maybe it's along the narrative of that blame the victim mentality. But this question is coming in from John. It says, what are some of the best reactions and improvements that you've seen coming from these attacks, and what have we, the royal we, learned and put into practice that's worth pointing out?
Well, there are a million lessons about the individual kind of technical vulnerabilities that allowed Sandworm to do what they did, but that is just like a Sisyphean problem. I mean, there will always be more bugs to patch, more software that should have been updated, or networks that should have been better segmented, or whatever. To me, the main lesson that I really wanted to get across in this book is about trying to create a kind of set of global norms and a system of deterrence to tell the West that we need to send a message to groups like Sandworm, to agencies like the GRU, that you can't just get away with this stuff. That even when it's Ukraine, when it's not us, when it's not NATO, when it's not the EU, this is unacceptable. Nobody is allowed to carry out destructive cyber attacks against civilians, and this, especially in this kind of reckless, just catastrophic way. That's not right in terms of our principles of human rights. That it's not smart for us to ignore this stuff in terms of our own interests. So we saw how we are connected to these victims in Ukraine in ways that we didn't expect, and that we need to act to sanction, to indict. Maybe that's kind of a controversial one, but most of all, just to send the message to, in 2016, the Obama administration used this kind of secret messaging system, this hotline they set up with the Kremlin, to send a message to Putin to say, we know you hacked our election, that you were interfering in our election, and that's not okay. But they sent no message like that about what was happening in Ukraine, even after 2 blackout attacks that affected civilians, and that was a mistake. So that was like that was what I was really hammering on in the book. And then in February, we saw the U.S. State Department and the UK government call out Sandworm for carrying out a rather, not even a NotPetya or a blackout attack, but a kind of, only moderate-sized attack in the country of Georgia. But in this case, the Western governments are starting to actually name and shame, to say this was Sandworm and it's not okay. We condemn this action, even though Georgia is not a part of NATO. Even though it's not, like, officially, it's not us. Like, that was an unacceptable act, and we won't stand for it. And I think that's when I saw that. And by the way, I should say that the Trump administration actually contacted me ahead of time to tell me they were going to do this in February, which to me was like a sign, not that I had caused it, but that they were trying to just send a message to me to say, yeah, we heard what you were criticizing us for, and we're changing our approach. So that to me is like what we, the royal we, have learned, I hope, is that we need to talk about these things publicly. We need to call out bad actors at the very least.
Yeah, so it sounds like the feedback loop among silos at both internally here in the U.S. and externally is really starting to go back and forth, and there's more dialogue right there. And man, you must be reading the Q&A, because that leads us literally right into our next question from Devin, which is that the news has been reporting that a lot of the actors like U.S. Cybercom, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, have been actively publishing stories about some of the things that they've been doing back and forth, and like that public condemnation that we just saw recently. Do you think that at least right now, maybe the one hasn't turned yet, but do you think that that change in policy and change in communication is going to be successful in deterring interference?
Well, there's two kinds of deterrence, I think, in that question. That, if I understood it correctly, like there's this defense forward thing of like we're gonna hit back. We're not gonna wait for the enemy to hit us. We're gonna like go into their networks and blow stuff up and send a message that way. I think I'm very wary. I'm very, personally, like I'm a little skeptical of this approach that we're going to deter extremely reckless, huge appetite for risk Russian hackers by hacking them. I mean, that seems much more likely to me to be like the ingredients of, to be the groundwork for escalation, that we do something rather restrained to them, because Cyber Command honestly is pretty restrained. I need to give the U.S. government credit compared to Sandworm. I mean, these are very targeted attacks. But then if you do that to Unit 74455 of the GRU, I just, having a sense of their personalities and the way that they've behaved, I think that they hit back 100 times as hard, because they don't really think strategically. They think it seems like they act very emotionally in this almost petty bully-like way. So to me, the way you deter is not with, firing back in the same domain, because I think that that's just going to create escalation. You instead use these kinds of responses that Sandworm, I don't think, enjoys as much, like sanctions, like indictments that prevent them from going on vacation in Europe or Thailand or whatever, and also just kind of international shame to call out what they've done and make Russia into a pariah if necessary. That's or at least to call out the ways that the GRU is this malevolent force. That to me is a more effective means of deterrence.
Phenomenal, love it. I know we're getting close here on time, but before we, we've got probably enough questions to take us here, at least till the end of the day. But before we jump into those real quick, I know we talked about something briefly, and the thing that cued me off was talking about people jumping and vaulting over turnstiles in order to go in and remediate issues during some of the hacks. And that kind of reminded me of Olympic Destroyer. So could you maybe just jump into that real quick?
Right. I mean, that's the one big attack that we haven't talked about in this whole like arc of Sandworm's, path of destruction. So the maybe the biggest like action in the third act of this book is that Sandworm hit the 2018 Winter Olympics too, with this attack where they destroyed the entire IT back end of the Olympic Organizing Committee just as the opening ceremony was beginning for the Olympics, which is just a terribly cruel thing to do. And these poor, administrators for the Olympics had to spend the next 12 hours frantically rebuilding the entire network, and which they succeeded at, which is amazing, which is kind of a heroic thing. But then they also, Sandworm built in all these false flags, layers upon layers of them, just to confuse any, researchers and incident responders. So that was I tell that story in part because I think that the Sandworm is not just escalating its destructive capabilities, but also its deception techniques too. And we need to be aware that false flags are getting better, and that they may, I don't know if they're ever going to fool the NSA or other intelligence agencies that can hack the hackers and you have human intelligence, but they really might fool a lot of us in the private sector if we're not careful. They're getting more sophisticated. But then the other thing about Olympic Destroyer that I can't help but say is that there has still never been any government's response to it. The Korean government, this took place in Pyeongchang, Korea. The Korean government, the US government, the UK government, no government has ever said that this was carried out by Sandworm or Russia or anything about it. Which to me is this, even as we're getting better about calling out these attacks, the fact that we let that happen with no response to me is still flabbergasting. And I was especially concerned about it when I thought that the 2020 Olympics were going to happen. Now it seems like we've been given like maybe more time to correct this mistake. But if we don't, I feel like if we don't call out an attack on the Olympics that was designed to sabotage the whole event, then we're just asking for it to be repeated.
Especially for an event that the entire meaning behind it is an opportunity, traditionally, historically, to put down your weapons and come together for competition.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not the first time that the Olympics has been hit with. I think it is the worst cyber attack to hit the Olympics ever, as far as I know. But it is still just. It is also just appalling, like to me, that Russia would do this, and not even to send a message, but just for their. I mean, because they were trying to hide their tracks. But instead to, I don't know, just for their own kind of, to me, what seems like just a kind of petty vindictiveness. Like they were banned from those Olympics because of their coordinated doping campaign. And so they're just have the sense that if they can't enjoy the Olympics, then no one will. And like they carried out this very sophisticated cyber attack just to please themselves, apparently. I mean, it's very, very strange. And yeah. It's I think pretty shameful.
See, I'm going to see if I can find a question that you can answer in a minute or less here. Hank kind of brought up, do you see the opportunity for future companies to hack back? And if so, would that lead to more destruction and damage in the long run? And real quick before you answer, for anybody that's interested in that hack back, check out House Resolution 4036, which is the Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act.
Sorry, I was busy reading. I'm looking too deep in the comments, and but it sounds like the question is you know, about hacking back, and I don't. I've always been extremely skeptical of hacking back as a technique that could work. I mean, you don't want to be in a kind of private sector battle of escalation with Sandworm. I mean, they have more hacking resources than you will have as a company. They are willing to do things that you are not legally allowed to do, or probably shouldn't be doing, even if some bill makes it legal. Like, you don't want to release a kind of unrestricted worm in their network, but they will do it to you, it seems like. So, and you probably are concerned about restraining your hacking back. They are unrestrained in the way that they will attack you, and don't care if what collateral damage seems to result. So, I mean, in terms of these sorts of actors, I definitely think hacking back is a bad idea. I mean, maybe there's some world where more criminal hackers go after you, but and you hack back, but I don't know, that seems risky too, and it just seems like there are always going to be better responses, and it's, as I was saying, with these kind of strategies of deterrence, you just don't want to play the same game as people who are willing to break all the rules. Like you use the other games against them. You use a game with different rules, like law enforcement and attribution and getting them arrested and put in prison.
Everybody loves a David and Goliath story, but in this case, Goliath is a whole lot bigger, and there's many of them.
Yeah.
I'm so
Denise, go for it.
Yeah, we're running out of time, and I hate to cut this short, but if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to send them my way, and I will bug Andy to try to, during his spare time, to answer them. But I really hope you enjoyed our session today. I really appreciate you taking time to spend your time with us and found value in this. And if you haven't read the book, please read it, for the 10 of you that haven't yet. And if you want any time to spend with us one-on-one to talk about your organization security needs, then please feel free to contact us. And there's a little, you can just respond to the email from the registration, and that's about it. So I hope everyone has a really great weekend. Thank you again, Andy, for joining us today. And I look forward to talking to all of you soon.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. It was really fun. The questions were amazing. Thanks to everyone for joining, but especially thanks to you guys for organizing all this.
No problem.
Thank you, Andy.
It's a pleasure. Have a good day, everyone.